This is my true story. I raised my son alone after his mother died and gave him everything. I helped him start his business with money he never paid back. I co-signed his mortgage when banks refused him. I lived in his house for 2 years, helping with his children and paying for groceries. Last month he called me into the living room with serious news. He said his father-in-law is moving in next month and we only have one extra bedroom. He said I needed to leave because his wife's father was the priority. What I did next destroyed his entire life. Before I tell you, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. I raised my son as a single father after his mother died when he was only 4 years old. She died suddenly from an illness that took her in less than 2 weeks. My son was too young to fully understand what was happening. One day his mother was there, and then she was gone. I became both father and mother to him. I had to learn how to do everything alone, how to cook his meals and help with homework and comfort him when he had nightmares. I worked full-time while also being the only parent he had. It was exhausting, but I never complained because he was all I had left. I sacrificed every comfort to give him the best education money could buy. I worked long hours and took extra jobs to afford private school tuition. I went without new clothes and without vacations and without anything for myself. Every dollar I earned went toward giving my son opportunities I never had. I wanted him to have the best teachers and the best facilities. I wanted him to grow up with advantages that would help him succeed in life. I believed investing in his education was investing in his future. I was proud of the sacrifices I made because I thought they would give him a better life. When my son graduated from college and said he wanted to start his own business, I supported him completely. He had an idea for a company, but no money to get started. Banks would not give him loans because he had no credit history and no collateral. He came to me asking for help. I took out a substantial loan against my retirement savings and gave him the money to start his business. It was over $200,000. He promised he would pay me back once the business was profitable. I trusted him and never asked for the money back even when the business became very successful. I also funded his lavish wedding when he got married. His wedding was expensive with hundreds of guests and a luxury venue. My son and his fiancée wanted everything to be perfect. I paid for most of the wedding costs because I wanted my son to have the celebration he wanted. I took out additional loans to cover the expenses. I figured I would pay them off slowly over time. What mattered was that my son was happy on his wedding day. I stood there watching him get married and felt proud that I could give him this gift. When my son wanted to buy a house a few years later, he again had problems getting approved for a mortgage. His business was doing well, but banks were still hesitant because he had not been in business long enough. He asked if I would co-sign the mortgage to help him qualify. I agreed without hesitation. I put my name and my credit on the line so he could buy the house he wanted. The bank approved the mortgage because of my co-signature. My son and his new wife moved into a beautiful house that I had helped make possible. I believed every dollar I invested in my son's success was planting seeds of gratitude that would bloom when I needed him most. I thought the sacrifices I made would create a bond between us. I thought when I got old and needed help, my son would remember everything I had done for him. I thought he would want to take care of me the way I had taken care of him. I thought our relationship was built on love and mutual support. I thought family meant something to him. 2 years ago, when I was getting older and having health problems, my son invited me to move in with him. He said I should not live alone anymore. He said I could stay in their extra bedroom and they would take care of me. I was touched by the offer and accepted. I moved in thinking this was my son showing gratitude for everything I had done. I helped around the house. I took care of my grandchildren after school. I paid for groceries and utilities. I tried to be helpful and not be a burden. I thought I was welcome in my son's home. I thought I was valued, but I was wrong about everything. The generosity I had shown my son for his entire life was about to be repaid with the cruelest betrayal I could imagine. My son's wife entered our lives like a storm disguised as sunshine. When I first met her, she was charming and friendly. She smiled and said all the right things. She told me how wonderful it was to meet me. She said she had heard so much about me from my son. She said she was grateful for everything I had done to raise him and support him. She seemed like a kind person who genuinely cared about my son. I was happy he had found someone who seemed to love him. I welcomed her into our family with an open heart. But gradually over the years, her true nature began to emerge. After they got married and settled into their life together, she started to change. The charm and friendliness faded. She became critical and cold toward me. She would make small comments about things I did or said. She would question my opinions and make me feel foolish. She would correct me in front of other people. She would roll her eyes when I spoke. The warmth she showed me in the beginning disappeared completely. I realized the nice person I met had been an act to win my son's approval. She began poisoning my son against me with whispered complaints about my so-called interference. When I would offer advice or suggestions about anything, she would later tell my son that I was being controlling. When I would share my opinions, she would say I was trying to run their lives. When I would help with household tasks, she would complain that I was overstepping boundaries. She twisted every helpful action into something negative. She made it seem like I was a problem instead of a supportive father trying to help his family. She complained about my old-fashioned ways constantly. She said I did not understand modern life. She said my ideas about parenting and marriage were outdated. She said I was stuck in the past and could not accept how things were done now. She made me feel like everything I believed was wrong. She dismissed my experiences and my wisdom as irrelevant. She acted like having me around was a burden she had to tolerate. She wanted me to know that my presence in their lives was not valued or appreciated. I watched my son transform from grateful to cold as his wife's influence grew stronger. The son who used to thank me for everything I had done stopped expressing gratitude. The son who used to call me regularly stopped reaching out. The son who used to ask for my advice stopped consulting me about anything. He became distant and detached. When I would try to talk to him about it, he would say nothing was wrong. But I could see the change. His wife had reprogrammed him to see me differently. I watched him transform from loving to indifferent. The warmth we used to share disappeared. The closeness we used to have evaporated. He stopped hugging me or showing affection. He stopped asking about my life or my health. He stopped caring about maintaining our relationship. When I would visit them before moving in, he would be polite but distant. There was no real connection anymore. His wife had successfully created distance between us that grew wider with each passing year. She rewrote our history to paint me as a burden instead of the father who had given him everything. She told my son that I was too involved in their lives. She said I expected too much from them. She said I made them feel obligated and guilty. She took all the sacrifices I had made and twisted them into something negative. She made it seem like helping my son was actually a way of controlling him. She convinced him that the $200,000 for his business and the co-signed mortgage and the paid wedding were all things I held over his head to manipulate him. By the time I moved into their house, my son had been completely turned against me by his wife. She had spent years poisoning our relationship. She had planted seeds of resentment and doubt. She had made him see me as a burden instead of a blessing. And now that I was living under their roof, she had the perfect opportunity to push me out completely. She just needed the right excuse and the right moment. And that moment came last month when her own father needed a place to live. Last month, my son called me into the living room of the house I had helped him buy. His voice was serious and formal. He said we needed to talk about something important. I followed him into the living room, wondering what this was about. His wife was already sitting on the couch with her arms crossed. She had a strange expression on her face. It was not quite a smile, but there was something satisfied about the way she looked at me. I sat down in the chair across from them, feeling suddenly nervous about what was coming. My son sat down next to his wife and took a deep breath. He said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." He said his father-in-law was having health problems and could no longer live alone. He said his wife's father needed someone to take care of him. He said as his only daughter, his wife felt responsible for making sure her father was looked after properly. He explained all of this in a calm, matter-of-fact voice, like he was discussing something routine. I nodded along, thinking this was leading to a discussion about how we could all help his father-in-law. Then my son said so her father is going to move in with us next month. He said they had already made the decision and had started making arrangements. He said his father-in-law would be moving into the extra bedroom. I felt touched by their compassion initially. I thought it was good that they were taking care of family. I thought it showed they had good values about supporting older relatives who needed help. I started to say something about how wonderful it was that they were doing this for her father. But before I could finish my sentence, my son continued talking. He said, "So you will need to find somewhere else to live." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. He said we only have one extra bedroom, and her father is the priority. He said it as if this was perfectly reasonable. He said it as if there was no other option. He said it as if I should understand and accept this without question. His wife sat next to him, nodding with that same satisfied expression on her face. I sat there in shock, unable to speak for a moment. I looked at my son. I looked at the man I had raised alone from the age of 4. I looked at the person I had sacrificed everything for. I looked at the son whose business I had funded with money he never paid back. I looked at the person whose mortgage I had co-signed when no bank would approve him. I looked at him sitting there telling me I needed to leave because his wife's father was more important than his own father. I could not believe what I was hearing. His wife stood behind him with a cold smile spreading across her face. She looked triumphant. She looked like someone who had just won a victory. This was what she had been working toward for years. She had poisoned my son against me. She had turned him into someone who could look his father in the eye and tell him to leave. She had orchestrated this moment where I would be pushed out to make room for her own father. She had successfully replaced me in my son's life, and now she was getting rid of me completely. I finally found my voice and said, "Wait, what are you saying?" My son would not look directly at me. He stared at the floor or at the wall, but not at my eyes. He said exactly what it sounds like. He said his father-in-law needs care, and they are his only family. He said I was still healthy and independent. He said I would be fine finding somewhere else to live. He said they needed the bedroom for someone who really needed help. The implication was clear. His father-in-law was a priority. I was not. His wife's father deserved their care and support. I did not. I sat there looking at my son and his wife announcing that I was being kicked out of the house I had helped them buy. They were telling me I had to leave so his father-in-law could move in. They were choosing her father over me. They were telling me I mattered less. And they were doing it without any apparent guilt or hesitation. This was the moment my heart broke completely. I looked at my son in disbelief and said, "I am your father." My voice came out quiet and shaking. I said those words slowly, letting them hang in the air. I needed him to hear them and understand what he was doing. I said, "I am your father, and you are telling me to leave so your father-in-law can move in." I said, "You are choosing him over me." I wanted him to acknowledge the cruelty of what he was saying. I wanted him to see how wrong this was. But he just sat there avoiding my eyes and saying nothing. I continued speaking, trying to make him understand. I said, "I have lived here for 2 years helping with your children." I said I pick them up from school and help with their homework and play with them. I said I am their grandfather, and I have been here supporting this family. I said I pay for groceries every week. I said I contribute to the utilities. I said I help around the house with cleaning and yard work. I said I am not a burden. I am helping. I am supporting this household in every way I can. I wanted him to see that I was not some freeloader taking advantage of their generosity. My son finally spoke, but he still would not look at me. He stared at the wall and said, "Her father raised her." He said her father sacrificed for her. He said her father worked hard to give her opportunities. He was listing all the things her father had done for his wife. Things that sounded exactly like what I had done for my son. But somehow when her father did those things, it meant he deserved care and support. When I did those things, it meant nothing. My contributions and my sacrifices did not earn me the same consideration. My son said, "You are still healthy and independent." He said I could take care of myself. He said I did not really need them. He said his father-in-law was older and had health problems and needed more help. He said they had to prioritize someone who truly needed care. He was making it sound like choosing her father over me was the logical and compassionate choice. He was making it sound like I should understand and accept this because I was capable of living on my own. He was dismissing me because I was not sick or helpless enough to matter. He said, "You will be fine somewhere else." He said it with such certainty. He said I would find a place to live and I would be okay. He said I was capable and strong. He said I did not need to rely on them. He was trying to make kicking me out sound like a compliment. He was trying to make it sound like I was being excluded because I was too independent and self-sufficient. But I knew the truth. I was being kicked out because his wife wanted me gone, and he was too weak to stand up to her. His wife's smile widened as she watched my heart break in real time. She stood there taking pleasure in my pain. She had orchestrated this entire situation. She had convinced my son that her father deserved the bedroom more than I did. She had convinced him that I should leave. She had won the battle to get rid of me. And now she was standing there enjoying watching me realize I had been replaced. She looked at me with satisfaction and triumph. She had successfully pushed me out of my son's life. I sat there feeling the full weight of their cruelty and calculated rejection. This was not a difficult decision they had struggled with. This was not something they felt conflicted about. They had made this choice easily and were presenting it to me as a done deal. They were not asking for my input or discussing options. They were telling me I had to leave. My son was choosing his wife's father over his own father without hesitation or remorse. He was valuing her family over his own blood. He was rejecting the father who had raised him alone and given him everything. I looked at both of them sitting there waiting for me to accept this and leave quietly. They expected me to just pack my things and go. They expected me to understand and not cause problems. They had no idea what they had just done. They had no idea what I was about to do. They thought I was powerless and would have to accept whatever they decided. But they were very wrong. What my son and his wife did not know was that I still had legal access to almost everything they thought belonged to them. Years ago, when I helped my son start his business, he had no credit history and no financial standing. Banks would not give him business accounts or credit lines in his name alone. So I opened all the business accounts with my name as the primary account holder. I added my son as an authorized user and manager. The plan was that once his business was established and he built credit, we would transfer everything to his name alone. But that transfer never happened. As the years passed and his business grew successful, we both forgot about the original account structures. My son started thinking of the business accounts as his own. He managed them and used them and made all the decisions. He stopped thinking about the fact that my name was still on everything as the primary holder. He assumed at some point the accounts had been switched to his name only. But they had not. I was still listed as the primary owner on every business account his company used. The same situation existed with his investment accounts. When my son first started making money from his business, he wanted to invest but did not know how. I helped him set up investment portfolios and retirement accounts. Again, because of his limited credit history and financial background, I had to open the accounts in my name first. I added him as a beneficiary and gave him full access to manage the investments. Over time, as the accounts grew and multiplied, my son thought of them as his money. But legally, I had never removed my name or my access. There was also a substantial emergency fund that I had built for him over the years. I had been setting aside money in a high-yield savings account meant to protect him if his business ever faced hard times. The account had grown to over $1 million. My son knew the account existed because I had told him about it years ago, but he thought it was an account in his name that I had contributed to. He did not realize the account was actually in my name with him listed as a beneficiary. He could not access it without my permission. Altogether, there was approximately $8 million in assets sitting in accounts that my son believed were his alone. The business accounts held about $4 million in operating capital and reserves. The investment portfolios were worth about $2.5 million. The emergency fund was over $1 million. Some smaller accounts added up to a few $100,000 more. My son looked at bank statements and investment reports and saw his name and assumed everything was his. But the legal reality was different. I was still the primary account holder on everything. I had full access and full control. My son and his wife had forgotten about the foundation while enjoying the empire. They saw the successful business and the growing investments and the comfortable lifestyle. They enjoyed spending money and living well. They made plans based on the assumption that they owned and controlled $8 million in assets. But they had forgotten how it all started. They had forgotten that I was the one who made it possible by putting my name and my credit on the line when my son had nothing. They had forgotten that we never completed the process of transferring everything to his name. This oversight was about to become the most expensive mistake of my son's life. He was sitting there telling me I needed to leave his house because his father-in-law was more important than his own father. He was rejecting me and replacing me without any apparent guilt. He thought he held all the power in this situation. He thought I was dependent on him and had no choice but to accept whatever he decided. But he was wrong. I held power he did not even know existed. And I was about to use that power to teach him a lesson about loyalty and family that he would never forget. That night, after the devastating conversation in the living room, I went to my bedroom and closed the door. My son and his wife went about their evening routine as if nothing unusual had happened. I could hear them downstairs talking and laughing. They were probably relieved that the difficult conversation was over. They probably thought I would quietly pack my things over the next few days and leave without causing any problems. They had no idea what I was planning. They went to bed that night, sleeping peacefully in the house I had helped them purchase, completely unaware that their lives were about to be destroyed. I sat at the small desk in my bedroom and opened my laptop. I logged into the business bank accounts using my primary account holder credentials. I had not accessed these accounts in years, but my login information still worked. I could see everything. The operating account had over $2 million. The reserve account had another $2 million. The accounts were flush with cash from my son's successful business. I began the process of transferring every dollar out of those accounts. I moved the money through a series of encrypted transactions to offshore accounts I had established years ago for estate planning purposes. I had set up these accounts when I first started helping my son financially. I wanted to have secure places to hold money outside the normal banking system in case anything ever went wrong. I never thought I would actually need to use them for something like this. But now they were the perfect place to move money quickly and quietly without leaving an obvious trail. The transfers took several hours to complete because I had to stay under certain transaction limits to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. I moved money in chunks of a few $100,000 at a time, transfer after transfer after transfer. I watched the balances in my son's business accounts drop steadily towards zero. By 3 in the morning, the business accounts were completely empty. $4 million had been moved to my offshore accounts, where my son would never be able to find it or access it. Next, I logged into the investment accounts. These were more complicated because they held stocks and bonds and mutual funds rather than cash. I had to liquidate positions before I could transfer the money. I sold everything. I did not care about tax implications or market timing or anything else. I just wanted to convert everything to cash as quickly as possible. The liquidation orders went through automatically in after-hours trading. By morning, the positions would be sold and the cash would be available to transfer. While I waited for the investments to liquidate, I accessed the emergency fund account. This was the easiest transfer because it was just a savings account with cash sitting in it. I moved the entire balance of $1.2 million to my offshore accounts in a single transaction. The emergency fund my son thought would protect him in hard times was now gone. He had no safety net left. If his business faced any problems, he would have nothing to fall back on. By dawn, I had successfully moved approximately $8 million out of accounts my son thought were his alone. Every business account was empty. Every investment account was liquidated and drained. The emergency fund was gone. I had systematically dismantled his entire financial empire while he slept. The only thing I left behind was paperwork. I made sure to remove my name from all the accounts after the transfers were complete. I updated the account holder information to show only my son's name. Now, when he checked his accounts, he would see his name as the sole owner of a bunch of empty accounts. I also made sure to cover my tracks as much as possible. I used secure connections and encrypted transfers. I routed everything through multiple jurisdictions to make it difficult to trace. I wanted to make sure that even if my son figured out what I had done, he would not be able to recover the money easily or quickly. The $8 million was now safely in offshore accounts that only I could access. My son's empire had become an empty shell overnight, and by the time he woke up and discovered what had happened, I would be gone. I finished the transfers and account changes by 5:30 in the morning. The house was still quiet. My son and his wife were still sleeping upstairs in their bedroom. The children were asleep in their rooms. No one knew what I had spent the night doing. No one knew that $8 million had just vanished from accounts they thought were secure. I sat at my desk for a moment, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt satisfaction at what I had done. Part of me felt sadness that it had come to this. But mostly, I felt nothing. My son had made his choice, and now he would live with the consequences. I packed my single suitcase with the few belongings I cared about. I did not have much. Some clothes and personal items and a few photographs. Everything fit easily into one bag. I had been living a simple life in their extra bedroom. I had never accumulated many possessions because I always felt like a temporary guest, even though I had been there 2 years. Now I was leaving for real, and I was traveling light. I zipped up the suitcase and set it by the door of my bedroom. I took one last look around the room. I would never see this place again. Before I left, I sat down and wrote a note to my son. I took out a piece of paper and an envelope. I wrote in steady handwriting, making sure every word was clear and readable. I wanted there to be no confusion about what I had done or why I had done it. The note was brief and direct. I did not waste words on explanations or justifications. I simply stated the facts and let him draw his own conclusions about what had happened. I wrote that he had told me to leave because his father-in-law was the priority. I wrote that he had chosen his wife's father over his own father. I wrote that he had made it clear I was not important enough to keep around. I wrote that I understood his message loud and clear. I wrote that I was leaving just like he wanted. But I was not leaving empty-handed. I was taking something with me that belonged to me legally, even if he had forgotten that fact. I wrote that the $8 million he thought was his had actually been mine all along. I wrote that when I helped him start his business and set up his accounts, I remained the primary account holder. I wrote that we never completed the transfer to put everything in his name alone. I wrote that the money sitting in his business accounts and investment portfolios and emergency fund had been legally accessible to me this entire time. I wrote that I had just exercised my legal right to move that money to accounts under my sole control. I wrote that he should enjoy explaining to his father-in-law why they were now bankrupt. I wrote that the extra bedroom he wanted me out of was all his now. I wrote that he and his wife could use that room for her father and live happily knowing they had chosen the right priority. I wrote that I hoped his father-in-law appreciated the sacrifice my son had made by destroying his relationship with his own father. I wrote that some choices have prices, and this was the price of his choice. I signed the note simply as the father you replaced. I wanted those words to haunt him. I wanted him to think about the fact that he had replaced his own father with his father-in-law. I wanted him to remember that he had valued his wife's family over his own blood. I wanted the phrase to echo in his mind every time he thought about what had happened. I sealed the note in an envelope and wrote my son's name on the front. I picked up my suitcase and quietly walked downstairs. It was just after 6 in the morning. The sun was starting to rise, but the house was still dark and silent. I went to the kitchen and placed the envelope on the counter next to my house keys. The envelope was positioned prominently where my son would definitely see it when he came downstairs. I left my keys next to the note to make it clear I was not coming back. Then I walked out the front door, closing it quietly behind me. I got in my car and drove away from that house for the last time, heading toward the airport and the new life waiting for me. I drove straight to the airport from my son's house. It was early morning and the roads were mostly empty. I had already booked my flight weeks ago when I first started sensing that my son's coldness might become permanent. I had prepared for the possibility that I might need to leave suddenly. I had a one-way ticket to Lisbon, Portugal, departing at noon. I had packed my important documents and organized my finances. I had researched where I would live and what I would do. Everything was ready. I just needed to execute the plan. I arrived at the airport around 7:30 in the morning. I checked my single suitcase and went through security. I had several hours before my flight, so I sat in the terminal and waited. I turned off my phone completely. I did not want to receive calls or messages. I did not want to know when my son woke up and discovered what I had done. I wanted to be unreachable and unavailable. I sat there in the quiet terminal drinking coffee and watching people come and go. I felt strangely calm considering what I had just done. I felt like I was finally taking control of my life after years of being controlled by others. I had purchased a villa in Portugal months earlier, when I first sensed my son's coldness might become permanent. I had been researching places to live outside the country. I wanted somewhere with good weather and low cost of living and a peaceful lifestyle. Portugal checked all those boxes. I found a beautiful villa on the coast with ocean views. The property was private and quiet. I bought it using money from my personal savings. The villa was fully furnished and ready to move into. I had a place waiting for me that my son knew nothing about. By the time my flight boarded at 11:30, I felt ready to start my new life. I walked onto the plane and found my seat. I settled in for the long flight across the Atlantic. I did not look back. I did not feel regret or doubt. I felt liberated. I was leaving behind a son who had rejected me and a life where I was not valued. I was heading toward a future where I would be free and independent. The plane took off, and I watched through the window as the ground disappeared below. I was leaving everything behind and starting completely fresh. The flight to Lisbon took about 9 hours. I slept for part of it and read for the rest. I thought about what my son was probably experiencing back home. He would have woken up around 7 or 8 in the morning. He would have come downstairs and found the note and the keys on the kitchen counter. He would have read what I wrote and then checked his bank accounts online. He would have seen that everything was empty. He would have started calling me frantically. But my phone was turned off and the number would show as disconnected soon. He would try to email me, but I had already closed that email account. I had erased myself completely. I landed in Lisbon around 8 in the evening local time, which was 3 in the afternoon back home. By that point, my son had probably been in full panic mode for several hours. He had probably called lawyers and accountants trying to figure out what happened. He had probably called the banks demanding explanations. But there was nothing anyone could do. The transfers were legal. I was the primary account holder. I had every right to move my own money. The fact that my son thought it was his money did not change the legal reality. I collected my luggage and took a taxi to my villa on the coast. The drive took about an hour. When I arrived at the property, I felt immediate peace. The villa was beautiful, with white walls and blue shutters and a terrace overlooking the ocean. I could hear waves crashing against the rocks below. The air smelled like salt and flowers. I walked inside and put down my suitcase. This was home now. This was where I would live the rest of my life. I had $8 million funding a comfortable retirement. I had a beautiful place to live. I had freedom and independence, and I had zero regrets about what I had done. I settled into my new life in Portugal and maintained contact with my lawyer back home so I could receive updates about what was happening to my son. My lawyer sent me regular emails over the following weeks detailing the complete collapse of my son's life. Everything fell apart exactly as I knew it would. My son had built his entire existence on a foundation of money he thought was his. When that foundation disappeared, everything built on top of it crumbled. The destruction was total, and it happened fast. My son's business collapsed within the first week. Without the $4 million in operating capital and reserves, the company could not function. There was no money to pay employees or suppliers or rent. My son tried desperately to get emergency loans, but banks would not approve him. His credit was not strong enough to borrow millions on short notice. The business had payroll due, and bills due, and contracts due. None of it could be paid. Employees quit. Suppliers stopped delivering. Customers canceled orders. Within days, the business that had taken years to build was dead. His mortgage went into default almost immediately. My son had been making large mortgage payments on the expensive house I had helped him buy. Those payments came from the business accounts that were now empty. When the first payment bounced, the bank sent a default notice. My son had no way to catch up. He had no savings and no income now that his business was gone. The bank started foreclosure proceedings. My son and his wife had maybe 60 days before they would be forced out of the house. The home they thought was theirs was about to be taken by the bank. His wife's father never moved in because there was no longer a house to move into. The whole reason I was kicked out was to make room for her father. But now that plan was destroyed. There was no extra bedroom to offer him because they were about to lose the entire house. My son had to call his father-in-law and explain that actually he could not move in after all. He had to admit that their financial situation had suddenly collapsed. He had to tell her father that he needed to make other arrangements. The humiliation must have been overwhelming. The daughter-in-law who had orchestrated my dismissal left my son when the money evaporated. My lawyer sent me copies of divorce papers that were filed about 6 weeks after I left. My son's wife filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. But everyone knew the real reason. She had married wealth and status, not the man I had raised. She had enjoyed the lifestyle that my money made possible. She had liked living in a big house and taking vacations and spending freely. When all of that disappeared, she had no reason to stay. She left my son to deal with the financial ruin alone. It turned out she had been with my son for his money the entire time. She had never really loved him. She had loved what he could provide. She had loved the comfortable life and the financial security. She had married into what she thought was a wealthy family. When she discovered my son was actually bankrupt and in debt, she wanted out immediately. She took the children and moved in with her parents. She filed for divorce and demanded support payments my son could not afford. She abandoned him the moment things got difficult. My lawyer told me my son had to declare bankruptcy. There was no other option. He had massive debts and no assets and no income. The business was gone. The house was being foreclosed. His investment accounts were empty. He owed money to suppliers and creditors and the bank. Bankruptcy was the only way to get any relief. My son filed the paperwork and went through the humiliating process of admitting he was financially ruined. Everything he had built and everything he thought he owned was taken away. Everything crumbled exactly as their cruelty deserved. My son chose his wife over his father. He chose her manipulation over loyalty to the man who raised him. He chose to reject me so his father-in-law could move in, and the price of those choices was the complete destruction of his life. His business, his house, his marriage, his financial security, all gone, all destroyed, all lost because he forgot where it came from. I live peacefully now in my villa on the Portuguese coast. The $8 million I took from my son's accounts funds a comfortable retirement that lets me live exactly how I want. I wake up every morning to the sound of waves and the smell of ocean air. I have a beautiful home with space and privacy. I have everything I need and nothing I don't need. My life is simple and quiet and completely on my own terms. I am surrounded by people who value me for myself and not for my wallet or what I can provide. The community here is warm and welcoming. I have made friends who genuinely care about me. This is what my life should have been all along. My son sends letters through my lawyer. The letters started arriving about 2 months after I left. At first, they were angry and demanding. He wanted to know how I could do this to him. He said I had stolen his money and destroyed his life. He threatened legal action and claimed I had committed fraud. But my lawyer responded explaining that I was the legal owner of all the accounts. I had every right to transfer my own money. There was no fraud and no theft. My son had simply been wrong about who owned what. The angry letters eventually stopped when he realized there was no legal way to get the money back. Then the letters became desperate and apologetic. My son wrote that he was sorry for how he treated me. He said he made a terrible mistake choosing his wife over his father. He said he should never have told me to leave. He said he realized now how much I had done for him over the years. He said he understood that his business and his house and everything he had was only possible because of my help. He said he was financially ruined and his marriage had fallen apart. He begged me to help him. He begged me to give back at least some of the money so he could get back on his feet. But I never respond to any of his letters. My lawyer receives them and forwards copies to me. I read them and then I delete them. I feel nothing when I read his apologies and his pleas. He made his choice when he told me his father-in-law was more important than his own father. He made his choice when he told me I needed to leave the house I had helped him buy. He chose his wife's manipulation over his own blood. He chose to humiliate and reject the father who had given him everything. Now he has to live with the consequences of that choice. The letters keep coming every few weeks. My son's tone has become increasingly hollow and desperate. He writes about how hard his life is now. He writes about losing his business and his house and his wife. He writes about how he wishes he could go back and make different choices. He writes about how he understands now that I was the most important person in his life. But these realizations came too late. He only values me now because he lost everything. He only wants me back because he needs my money. If he still had his business and his house and his comfortable life, he would not be writing these letters. He would still think his father-in-law was the priority. I chose myself when my son rejected me. I took back what was legally mine and left him with nothing. I left the country and started a new life where I am valued and respected. I have no regrets about what I did. My son wanted me gone so badly. He wanted the extra bedroom for his father-in-law. He got what he wanted. The bedroom is empty now. His house is gone. His wife is gone. His money is gone. Everything is gone. He learned that some rooms cost $8 million to clear. He learned that choosing cruelty over loyalty has a price. He learned that rejecting your father has consequences. He wanted me out of his life. I made sure when I left, I took everything with me. Now he has the freedom he wanted, and I have the peace I deserve.